Hi, welcome back! In today's video, we'll explore one of the key mechanisms designed to guide the global energy transition, nationally determined contributions, commonly known as NDCs. We'll look at what they are, how ambitious their climate goals claim to be, and whether they truly reflect the economic and energy realities of each country. We'll also ask a crucial question: can a self-reported national climate plan ever be fully honest, or is it often a mix of good intentions and political compromise? And beyond that, we'll ask something even more fundamental. Are NDCs enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and protect the planet, or does the planet need a stronger voice? If your country has signed the Paris Agreement, it already has an NDC. These plans are public. You can look them up by simply searching your country's name and NDC. So let's begin. What are NDCs? Under the Paris Agreement, every country that ratifies it is required to submit a nationally determined contribution, or NDC. Originally presented as intended nationally determined contributions, these plans become official NDCs once a country joins the agreement. NDCs are national climate plans that outline how each country intends to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. They are updated every 5 years to increase ambition, and they are based on national sovereignty, not on global enforcement or externally imposed targets. NDCs aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, support climate adaptation, and limit global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. These goals are clear, necessary, and scientifically grounded. However, there is no binding global enforcement. Progress is largely self-reported, and the planet itself has no voice. NDCs don't act directly on emissions. Governments translate them into national policies. Some countries use emission caps through emissions trading systems. Authorities define a total limit, the cap, which is divided into allowances, each representing the right to emit 1 ton of greenhouse gases. Over time, the cap is reduced, increasing pressure to cut emissions. Other countries rely instead on taxes, standards, or subsidies. Carbon taxes put a direct price on emissions, making pollution more expensive. Standards set efficiency requirements, technology rules, or bans on certain fuels and processes. Subsidies lower the cost of clean alternatives such as renewables, public transport, or energy-efficient buildings. In these systems, emissions are not capped explicitly. Behavior is steered indirectly through prices, rules, and incentives. In all cases, these policies are how NDCs move from political promises into real-world action, and their effectiveness depends less on ambition on paper and more on the tools chosen to implement them. Today, almost every country in the world has submitted a nationally determined contribution. On paper, they all follow the same framework, but in practice they are very different. The main reason is structural. Some countries are built around producing and exporting energy, often from fossil fuels. Others depend heavily on energy imports or have more diversified systems. These structural differences shape everything: emission levels, policy choices, and the speed at which transitions are possible. This is why NDCs cannot be compared at face value. They reflect not only climate ambition, but also economic dependence, infrastructure, and historical pathways. The European Union is a good example of how these differences play out, even within a single climate commitment. So, the European Union submits a single NDC, a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. But the European Union is not a single country. It is a highly diverse patchwork of economies, energy systems, and emission profiles. To manage this, emissions are split into two groups. Heavy industry and power generation fall under a common European carbon market, with one shared emissions cap. Other sectors like transport, buildings, and agriculture are covered by national targets, which differ from country to country based mainly on economic capacity. This means the European Union can act as one emitter internationally while internally distributing responsibility unevenly. It is effective in reducing emissions, but it also shows how complex it is to turn a single climate promise into fair and realistic action. Now let's see how it goes from NDCs to carbon markets. NDCs set national climate targets. These targets create demand for emission reductions. Carbon markets respond to that demand. They turn emission reductions into measurable units, carbon credits, that can be traded. In theory, one credit represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, either avoided or offset. These credits are issued from certified projects and can be bought by governments, companies, or individuals. In this way, climate action becomes measurable and tradable. Today, almost every country in the world has submitted an NDC. On paper, this looks like a global success, but when these plans are added together, the picture changes. Even if all current NDCs were fully implemented, global emissions would still be far too high to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. According to United Nations assessments, current NDCs put the world on a path well above 2 degrees Celsius. Many plans depend on future technologies, carbon markets, or reductions that are difficult to verify. The problem is no longer participation. The problem is whether these plans are collectively sufficient and individually credible. A global carbon accounting framework would not replace NDCs. It would complement them. While NDCs focus on national commitments, GCA would focus on measurable outcomes. It would apply common accounting rules across countries, making efforts comparable and transparent. Crucially, it would distinguish between real emission reductions, emissions shifted across borders, and emissions postponed into the future through offsets. In other words, it would move climate governance from political language toward physical reality. Because what ultimately matters is not how good a plan sounds, but how much the atmosphere actually changes. Now, how would the Global Climate Authority operate in practice? Not to replace governments, but to complement national climate plans with global oversight, scientific limits, and accountability. At its core, an independent science council would define global carbon budgets based on climate science. It would also set common accounting rules, ensuring that emissions are measured consistently across countries and sectors. In this system, science defines limits, not politics. One of the most distinctive elements is the Earth Guardians Panel. This body would represent interests that are systematically excluded from political decision-making: ecosystems, future generations, and vulnerable regions. Its role is to assess long-term impacts and flag decisions that shift harm across borders or into the future. The planet has no vote, but this panel gives it a voice. A global monitoring and early warning system would track emissions and climate indicators using independent data, including satellites. Its role would be to assess whether policies reduce emissions now or simply shift damage across borders or into the future. What is measured cannot be ignored. Finally, a legal and enforcement body would link measurement to consequence. This does not mean global government, but global accountability. When agreed limits are exceeded or when reporting is misleading, this body could support sanctions, trade measures, or international legal action. Because without consequences, climate rules remain optional, and physics does not negotiate. A global climate authority would not replace national sovereignty. It would make planetary limits visible, measurable, and unavoidable. So, are NDCs enough? Nationally determined contributions were designed as a pragmatic solution. Countries define their own climate plans and update them every 5 years, with the goal of increasing ambitions over time. On paper, this created near universal participation. But when we look at the numbers, a different picture emerges. According to United Nations assessments, even if all current NDCs were fully implemented, global warming would still exceed the Paris Agreement limits. So the challenge today is no longer participation. It is whether these plans are collectively sufficient. If self-reported national plans are not enough, then a stronger independent voice may be needed. A global climate authority would not replace national climate action. It would help make planetary limits visible, measurable, and accountable. In doing so, it would give a voice to the one stakeholder that currently has none: the planet itself. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, feel free to share it or explore the listed sources, because when it comes to climate change, understanding the system is part of the solution. Bye!